Brad. How's it going?
It's going all right. How you doing, man?
I'm doing all right. Doing all right. It's good to see you. Truth be told, we've been bullshitting for about 20 minutes before I press record anyway. So
That's supposed to be behind the scenes stuff,
I
so
know.
people know that.
I
It's
know.
supposed to be like as though this is the first time that we've seen each other.
We're
I think
breaking.
that's the way it's supposed to be.
We're breaking the was that pulling the veil away from the
Yeah,
Wizard of
exactly.
Oz.
Pulling back the curtain.
Yes, yes. So Brad Rego is our guest for today. Brad is has many hats. He is a writer. He's a director. He's a producer. He's a director of photography. Um, a former IT specialist as well in his prior
Wow, you're
life.
going deep.
And Brad, I met Brad through a recommendation 8 years ago for Clandestine. We had real hard time finding a DP that we liked, that we wanted to work with, and then Brad, you came in, I think, like a month or two before we were going to start filming, and then it was awesome. It was such an awesome experience. We've kept in touch regularly for 8 years, and shared our war stories about filmmaking over that time. So yeah, so I know you are currently working on Cryptid, your current feature.
Yeah, yeah. So we're almost done, and I know I feel like that's the statement of every indie filmmaker on the planet, right? You're just
Mhm.
like, oh, we're almost done, because nothing is ever as segmented as you want it to be, right? Where it's like, okay, well, here's our start point, here's our end point, and then we're finished. It's
Yeah.
always sort of a rolling kind of date. But we were ready to go back in April of 2020. That was our original shoot date. So we had kind of geared everything up to then. Obviously, there were some things that happened in that
Hmm.
month, and
Hmm.
so a couple weeks before we had to delay it, and so we delayed it. At first, we delayed it until May. We're like, okay, well, we'll push it to May. We'll do it in May. That's a month. That should be fine. We should be totally fine if we just delay it a month. And then, of course, May turned into June, which then turned into, well, I can't even pick a date because who the hell knows what's going to happen. So then around end of July, when everything started to calm down, at least around here, we kind of thought, all right, well, it looks like there's a chance we might be able to get this in before the winter hits. So we saw a window to do it end of September through most of October, and started kind of putting it together. And so we ended up doing that. We shot for 3 weeks in October in Western Massachusetts and upstate New York, a little bit of Vermont. Um, and we shot, but we shot most of the film, but there were a few things that we couldn't quite get for
Hmm.
various reasons. We lost a couple locations because of COVID. There was a particular location where we had to shoot inside of a cave, where we can't really do it now because of the weather and the season. Apparently, they close caves in the wintertime. Who knew?
Who knew that one?
Right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm like, a cave, that should be fine. But when you start going out and looking for caves, you find out that there's a conservatory that manages these caves. And they said, no, you can't go in them during the winter because of hibernating bats.
Oh,
So, I mean, these are the weird things you learn.
I was going to say bears. I was going to say, hibernating bear, I would be more concerned about, but
Yeah, no, apparently bats hibernate in these caves and they're afraid of disturbing the bats. So you're not allowed in there. The only way you can go in is on a scientific expedition. That's the only way. And
wow.
so our movie Cryptid is about a monster movie. And I tried to let him know, like, hey, listen, it's like, we're filming a mythical creature inside of a cave. That's sort of like a scientific expedition.
Uh-huh.
But
There you go
nobody
for it.
yeah, nobody really bought that. So there was like a couple scenes that we couldn't quite do in October, and then of course the COVID numbers shot up, and it kind of everything became kind of locked down again. So kind of in the beginning of the year, we're like, all right, we got a couple scenes we got to do. We were going to sort of stagger it out, but it just became too difficult to do. And so finally, now that as the numbers have started to come down again, we saw a window here at the end of this month. So
Uh-huh.
I don't know when this is going to actually pop up on YouTube, but from March 27th to April 4th is sort of our last week of filming, where we're able to combine all the stuff that we didn't get in October, along with, at this point, we've cobbled together a rough cut of what we shot in October. So now it's kind of actually nice. I can kind of see things and be like, oh, you know what? We really need like this establishing shot, or we could really use this a little differently. And so, combined all that stuff together into one solid week to be like, okay, this is entirely everything that we need left to do in this 1 week, so that once we're done with this, then God help me, we'll be done filming this movie.
So I know. I mean, we were talking when you were getting ready to do it in September, and you've been very steadfast and consistent and persistent in saying like I want to get this thing done.
Mhm.
You have to follow all these regulations, which I know you did because we talked about it. So
Mhm.
that created challenges. But you really did. You stuck to it, and you got the primary bulk of your film done in September, October, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because there was that moment in August where, we're rushing around and we knew that, the fall was coming, and especially in the Berkshires of Massachusetts, fall and winter come very quickly.
Mm,
So I knew kind of going into it that we kind of picked the dates that was what we thought was the latest we could possibly start filming, which I think was September 28th.
yeah.
I think was the date that we had, where it was like, okay, this is the latest we can start filming this movie without running into serious weather problems. And so, you know, that kind of came about somewhere in August is when we sort of made the call to be like, okay, let's try and do this.
Hmm.
Then we're rushing around. We had, a little bit less than a month or so to put it all together. And, there was certainly times where you start doubting yourself and be like, is it worth it to rush? Like, would it be better to just delay it for the winter and then attack it in the spring? Then you're not rushing around, and you can kind of acclimate a little bit better to the COVID stuff, because all that stuff was really new, and all like the protocols that we had to do, nobody really knew anything about that. It was all very fresh and new, and it was seemingly those protocols were changing daily. So it was
Yeah.
very difficult to sort of keep on top of it. And so we did have that sort of moment of like, should we just delay this until the spring? But ultimately, when it came down to it, the unknown factor of where everything was going to go, I didn't know what it was going to look like in spring. It could be worse. Like, I had no idea. And so I thought, if there's any chance that we could do this now, we got to take a shot at it, because it's too easy to push off. It's too easy to say, oh, you know what, we'll do it. We can do it next week or next month or next year. That happens. I feel like that's the number one thing that happens to independent filmmakers, is this
Yeah.
sort of moving the goalpost constantly.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so I really, especially we were so close. We were 3 weeks out from filming in April. We had already delayed it 6 months. I really didn't want to say, okay, well, let's see what happens next spring. Delay it another 6 months, and then we don't even know what's going to happen. We don't, it might be even harder. And so
Yeah.
so yeah, so it was, once I was able to kind of wrap my head around that, it was like, now if we have a chance to do it, I don't care. Let's just try and get as much as we can get in. If things go wrong and we lose something and we have to pivot, hey, that's the way the game works. But I'd rather give it a shot and see what we can do than push it off another X amount of months and then see what happens. And really, we got lucky. Like, we didn't run into any real issues, other than we lost a couple locations that we were able to sort of pivot. And in a few situations, we got better locations than what we originally had planned for.
Hmm.
So that ended up working out okay. And we got access to a couple locations that we might not have. Like, for instance, there was a bar there was a scene that takes place in a bar. And when we were back in April, we were a little concerned with that, because bars are open a lot, and so it's difficult to kind of get the time. We needed like a full day inside of a bar, so that meant we were either going to have to shoot after they closed at like midnight and do an all-nighter, or we're going to have to figure out some way to do it where there are limited customers involved. It was just going to be a little bit of a struggle. But when we shot in October, I mean, the bar wasn't even open, like, because they couldn't.
Mm.
So it ended up being a little bit easier to reach out to a bar owner and say, hey, is it cool if we film in your bar? And the guys that owned it said, yeah, sure. Like, it's just sitting there. We live next door, so we can just open it up for you, and we're able to go in and shoot all day and not have to worry about customers or anything else. So,
Yeah.
I guess there is some good and bad with it, right? Like, it caused a lot of problems, but it also kind of helped in some others. And so I think we made the right call, because we ended up getting 85% of the movie. We only really had to push we only had to really push one full scene and then a couple little shots here and there. So yeah, I think we made the right decision, because now at least, even though everything is still a little squishy with what's going on,
Hmm.
our need to do it is much smaller, right? Like, our footprint now and what we need to get done is much, much smaller. Now it's like 1 week and we're done, as opposed to now trying to schedule a full 3 or 4 week shoot.
Yeah. No, and I mean, like you said, there's certain things that really you were able, I'm going to say take advantage of is the wrong thing, but a bar that shut down that isn't generating any income, and
Mm-hmm.
you're like, hey, we'd like to shoot in your bar and we can give you some money, and they're
Mm-hmm.
like, well, shit, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, here you go. So I think that's, if you are alert and aware, and you're kind of have a good business sense, which you do, you kind of see those opportunities of, hey, this is a good time to actually do this, which is what you were saying. I was saying, well, why don't you just wait a little bit? And you were like, nope, gotta go, gotta do it. I'm going. It's gonna happen. I can't. If I wait any longer, I'm gonna die. And you're
Yeah.
like, and it's. I just feel like it's the time to do it, and that's a filmmaker thing. It's like, nope, now's the time, and
Mm-hmm.
you feel it, and it's very much like, we're gonna go, we're gonna make it happen, and you obviously felt that way, and you did it. So I wanted to ask you, you primarily do horror, right? That's your genre. Um, what is it? The thing that I like about your films, and I've said this to you multiple times over the last 8 years, so you're going to hear it again, but everyone else will be hearing it for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
What I like what you do with your horror films is you add a lot of character development and human beingness to the story and to the people. It's not simply a watch this girl's head fly off, watch this guy's arm get, chomped off. Not that those things don't happen, because Jacob Marr, one of your prior films, there were some obvious killing and going on in that. But I cared about the characters, and I was hoping, oh, I hope that one doesn't die. I hope that one doesn't die.
Right.
Which means I'm now invested, as an audience member. That's something you do with your stories that I really like, that you put that time and effort into it. And then I know that's something that certain horror aficionados don't like. So, well, my question is, what is it about that you like? Like, why do you choose to add that extra dimension to your films, so they're not just like a slash and blood splurt type of movie?
I think it really comes down to, it's the ones that I like,
Hmm.
right? And I think that's a fairly generic filmmaker thing, right? We all make sort of the movies that we enjoy ourselves. Now, I'll confess, I do enjoy uh like crazy blood and guts, lighthearted gore stuff, tongue in cheek, whatever. Like,
Hmm.
that has a place where I can watch it and enjoy it to some degree. Um, but the movies that affected me the most, and the movies that got me interested in making movies slash horror movies specifically, are the movies that are slower burning, are deeper films. They're not just sort of painting blood on the walls. There's a more psychological element to it, where the characters are more interesting,
Hmm.
and so the movies that I think of, the movies that influenced me, and the movies that scare me to this day, are the ones that have that element to it. Like, I think of like the classics, like Exorcist or The Omen or Alien, or The Thing, or all of these sort of like movies that I kind of grew up with, and movies that kind of got me fascinated with the making of horror movies. those are all that style, right? They're not, I've watched, I've watched all the Nightmare on Elm Streets and Friday the 13th and Halloween's, and I love them for their own reasons.
Yeah.
But what sticks with me, the things that stick with me and scare me when I turn the light off at night, are stuff from those other movies, right? Those slower burn style, not necessarily stylistic, but those slower burn sort of deeper films.
Hmm.
And so, you know, that's the movie that I want to make. And so those are the ones that I try to gravitate to the most. And that's something that it's kind of nice because it's having a bit of a resurgence, that kind of movie,
Yeah.
where for a while that was lost. We had it in the, when the horror movies sort of came out, like there was a lot of premiere directors that did horror movies, and it wasn't quite had the stigma that it had now today.
Right.
And then it went away for a bit in the 90s and the 2000s, in the early 2000s, where it was like a couple here and there, but it kind of got kind of offset to schlock and this as sort of very stereotypical nonsense. But within the last couple of years, there's been a few kind of horror directors that have come up and have done sort of a deeper, slower burning, more thought-provoking horror, which is, it's kind of nice to see that kind of coming back. So uh,
What are some of your favorites of those newer slower burn horrors that you've seen, or directors?
well, I mean, some of the, even like the things like Hereditary, that came out a couple years ago, and even Midsummer that he did, which I'm completely blanking on his name right now. Of course, you would ask that question, and now it's completely gone. But like, Robert Eggers from The Witch, I really enjoyed that movie, and then he did The Lighthouse, which I wasn't is a little it was a little off for me. I didn't love The Lighthouse, but I loved his sort of vision of it.
Was that the one with Pattinson and Defoe?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Ari Aster. That's the
Okay.
hereditary. Um, so like stuff like that, and then there was a few sort of things in the middle that have come out that have been really good. Things like, the Autopsy of Jane Doe, and I just watched uh, Wounds on Hulu, which was really good. It's just, there's a lot more that have coming out recently that, although although I don't know some of the directors specifically, some of these are like first time directors, or started doing just a couple things. They're kind of just up and coming.
Yeah.
It's movies that I see and I'm like, oh yes, I like what you're doing here. I like this sort of vibe. And so I'm gonna have to watch for your stuff in the future.
Hmm.
So yeah, but it's nice to see. It's nice to see that kind of coming back, getting into
Yeah.
that a bit more fleshed out kind of horror.
I've
No pun,
noticed in what?
I said no pun intended.
I've noticed in general, I felt like we had entered a dark ages of filmmaking in like the early to mid 2000s for about 10 years. Like
Mm,
there was no character development, there was no, and I think that's what was just being pushed into the movies because streaming hadn't really exploded.
mm,
And cable series like Breaking Bad, The Shield, Walking Dead, those shows, people started getting really, Game of Thrones. I didn't watch that one, or Walking Dead or Breaking Bad, but I appreciate what they do in them. But the thing that really attracted people to them was character development. They got pulled into these characters, and what was going on. And I think that started to kind of like maybe get the filmmaking storytelling rails back, the ship back on those rails, where people were like, well, you need something. It can't just always be an explosion, and it can't always be, a body part. And there needs to be something that pulls a human being into the story. Like what
mm.
is making them relate to the tale. So I think it is interesting. And I think that the explosion of opportunities to showcase your projects nowadays with the streaming services and everything else, I think has opened the door to more of those slow burn stories where people want to be entertained a little bit. And kind of, I mean, the thing I've always loved about movies, whether it was a horror movie, an action movie, a comedy, was I like getting like feeling like I'm settling into that world.
Mm.
I want to feel like, I mean, it's funny. It's not considered a horror movie, but Monster Squad that came out back in, the day. I remember watching that as a kid and being like, "Oh, this I feel like I'm going into that town."
Right.
The first Batman movie in '89, I felt like I was entering into this other world, this other reality, slightly adjacent to our own or whatever. And then I could relate. Then I could identify. I wanted to know what that world was like. So I think that that's an interesting thing that's going on with filmmaking nowadays. Is there's kind of like that need to tell a story is coming back. Do you see that as well in your experience?
Well, it's funny, and I feel like we've talked about this before, but the whole explosion of the streaming platforms has created or has created sort of an interesting world for indie filmmakers, right? Because in the past there was like a very specific sort of route you would have to go in order to get your stuff seen.
Mhm.
Like you'd make a movie, you'd go to a film festival, you hope you get a distribution company who could pick it up, and then maybe you get some, you could see the sell it as DVDs or whatever, or maybe you go through, you get it on DVD on Netflix or something like that. It just, you wouldn't really be able to do any. You wouldn't think about theaters. That's not really possible. But as far as where your movie could live was extremely limited, right? Where people could see it. And it was generally centered around a physical something, right? Someone would have to go to your website or go to your whatever and buy the disc or,
Mhm.
or something along those lines, right?
Yeah.
But now with sort of so many streaming options available, it's allowed filmmakers to kind of play a little bit more and be a bit more experimental and kind of not have to worry about, oh well, I gotta hit this narrow, I gotta thread the needle with exactly what this distribution company wants, because they're not going to take my movie if I don't, you
Yeah.
know. And so now there's so many things out there looking for content that you can get more, I guess, artisanal. I don't know what you want to call it, but you can kind of get a bit more specific as to what you want to do, and you don't have to have, well, like talking to distribution companies back in the day about horror movies. And I remember having a conversation with a distribution guy back when I made Jacob Marr, and he had watched, and he's like an old school distribution guy, and he said, I think your movie's good and everything, but if you could cut like a half an hour out of it and add some boobs in there, it'd be much better.
I
You know?
remember you, I remember you telling me that story, and
Yeah.
I was like, Jesus Christ, man.
Yeah, and it's just like, it's like, yeah, that's the old school sort of way of thinking of the way the distribution model is now. You've got whole websites dedicated to like Shudder that does streaming horror, and it runs the gamut of any kind of horror you're looking for. You can do the boobs and blood, gratuitous violence and sex. You can do the complete psychological horror, terror, um, you know, two people in a room freaking out, and then you can run anywhere in the middle, and there is an audience for it. And so it's fragmented everything, which is great for the filmmaker. It of course there's a negative aspect to it, which is the fragmentation means that there's just a lot of noise out there, and so
Yeah.
it's a little tougher for you to get your stuff seen.
Mhm.
But the ability to get it out there in a reasonable way where people have the ability to see it is much easier, right? The bar is much lower to be able to get it out there. Now, whether people see it is a whole other story, and that's hard as hell to do.
Yeah.
But at least you can get it out there. So now, as opposed to back in the day where it was like you run into someone and they're like, "Oh, how do I see your movie?" And it's like, "Well, go to this GeoCities site and type in this address and send me $5 in the mail, and I'll mail you a DVD of the movie." Like,
Yeah.
that's not really an issue. Now you can kind of go to, you can just be like, "Oh, it's on Amazon Prime,"
Yeah.
or, it's on Shudder, it's on Hulu, or a million other, that's just the big ones. There's like a million other streaming sites
Yeah.
like Tubi TV or Fantapix or whatever. Like, there's just like a million sites out there that you can get your movie on it. And if someone says, "Where can I see your movie?" Like, "Oh, just go to this website. It's on there." Either you rent it or you can, or it's free or it's ad based or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's kind of nice. That's kind of a nice thing. And then it's just a matter of finding your audience, which is obviously a huge issue in and of itself, but at least you can get it out there.
It's true. I mean, the thing that's like you have YouTube and then you have Popcorn Flicks, which
Right.
is, I didn't even know Popcorn Flicks existed until I did a search for Clandestine the movie, and I saw it was on Popcorn Flicks with like 140,000 views, and I was like, holy shit. And there was like over 200 to 300 positive comments and like a 900 thumbs up versus 100 thumbs down, which was in sharp contrast to Amazon, where people were like, we want to kill you. Where do you live? We hate your guts, you piece of shit. That's basic your Amazon customer. And then the people that you pissed off at some point in the last 46 years of your life, who now know that you have something you put your heart and your soul into, and they're going to come in and tell you your movie's a piece of shit. So adorable human beings. But anyway, the nice thing, the positive part of all that is with like Popcorn Flicks, it's true. And then you find out like what you get a better sense of what your audience is. Like, I mean, we audience tested Clandestine 4 to 5 different places, everything from zoo employees at the Bronx Zoo to social workers to college students to just regular townsfolks where the area we filmed the movie in. So we had some interesting perspectives from the audience testing results, but then to actually read just comments from people, you start to really get a sense of like who your movie is connecting with.
Mm.
And it's interesting. It's an interesting experience. We've never lived in a time with that really almost immediate feedback. When we started making movies in 2008, it was a Yahoo. GeoCities, Feenix Films had a GeoCities, and it was. I was mesmerized because I was like, oh, wait, I can create a button, and they can order, and then I can get a notice through PayPal, and then I just ship them the DVD. I'm like, this is astounding. Like, what is this witchery, and now it's true. It's like, oh, you want to see my movie? Go to Amazon and enjoy the comments. Go to Popcorn Flicks and get something a little bit more realistic, but you got to deal with ads, and they bleep out the 750 times I swear in the first like 15 minutes of the movie. But it's an interesting time. I think the things like you said is really true. The challenge is the chatter. And I don't ever I always say to people, if you make a movie, there was someone that we were helping. I was just giving him advice. He was extremely appreciative. But, I said, if you make your movie, that's a success. Even if everyone thinks it sucks, even if you think it sucks, which it didn't. He made a good movie with a lot of heart. But you made it. But it does make it difficult sometimes, though, where you have some people who, you do look at the project and you wonder, I mean, you made it. That's good. But I have to now try to get my film noticed as well. And then you go from supporting to almost competitive because you're like, there's so much stuff that's out there nowadays. I don't think like Martin Scorsese is discovered nowadays. You know what I mean? I think Martin Scorsese's got to fight it out in the trenches, and whoever is the last one standing is the one that kind of gets here's a development deal. I don't know. That's kind of what it feels like to me. But
yeah, no, I mean that's accurate because you think about when someone like a Martin Scorsese, or I mean he was a little bit before the I guess the artistic sort of renaissance that happened in the 70s. He kind of started that whole thing of this sort of art house cinema in like the 60s and the 70s. And back then, that's when you get your George Lucas's and your Steven Spielberg's and your Brian De Palma's and all this other stuff.
All those guys, yeah.
Yeah, and it was a bit more of a route that you could take, right? You go to film school, you get out of film school, you work on some movies, and then eventually you get your directing gig, and then you kind of try and work your way through it. There was just less people making. I mean, there was certainly a lot of people doing it, but there was much, much, much less people making it because the gatekeepers were, and whatever that happened to be, right? The gatekeeper, whether it be not having money or equipment or access or whatever, but there was just a much larger gatekeeper involved than there is today. I mean, now you can make a movie on your phone that looks as good as a movie at any other time. And so I just think not many people had the access to it. And so I think it was a little bit, I hate to use the word easier because that's too dismissive, but I
Right.
think it was a bit more accessible to kind of get your stuff into the process, right, of making your movie and getting it seen and kind of getting it out there.
Hmm.
Now it's just, you know, it's tough, and like there is a lot of failure and there is a lot of not getting it done. I mean, a friend of mine who always used to say this, and I have no idea if this is accurate or true in any way, shape, or form, but I like to think it is, where he says like 85% of independent films don't get finished.
Yeah.
And so if you just finish a movie, like that's a huge accomplishment.
Uh-huh.
And it's kind of to what you had just kind of mentioned, it where yeah, like just finishing a film is an achievement in and of itself.
Yeah.
And so the difficult thing is like once you do it, now you just have like a bunch of other problems.
Uh-huh.
But at least like, but that is a huge hurdle, like being able to finish the movie and say it's done and put it out there is a huge accomplishment. And unfortunately, unfortunately, the people who are reviewing movies don't really see it as that.
No.
And like some of the when Jacob Marr first ended up on Amazon Prime, and at first I was on the website every day checking it and like reading every review, and it was awful. Like it was like it would be like a good review and I'm like, yeah, all right, thank you, man, that's great. And then 6 bad reviews
Yep.
where it's just like awful, awful, awful. Which my favorite one, which I've said this many times, my favorite review that I've ever gotten is the entire review was, I've taken better shits than this movie. And so it was just like, oh, well, that's, I can't, there's nothing I can say to that.
Yeah.
That is, I mean, that's like complete brevity. You've used the minimal amount of words to really put your point across. I
Uh-huh.
can't be too upset. I can't be too upset about that.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, and you could probably speak to this as well, like you mentioned, where having this immediate access to these reviews, there is a value in it, you know,
Yeah.
where you can either you seek your audience and you can find out what people kind of were cluing in on versus what they weren't cluing in on.
Uh-huh.
And there are certain parts that will make you better by seeing all this stuff. Like I know the parts that when I read the reviews, the parts that hurt me the most, the parts that really dig deep, are the ones that I know there's a kernel of truth in. You
Uh-huh.
know, the ones that like they mention a thing where I'm like, yep, he's right, like, or she's right. I felt that as well. And I was hoping that I would put it by you. You know, I was hoping
Yeah.
that no one else would notice.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
only
Yeah.
you would
Yeah.
notice. And it's like, those are the things where you're like, that hurts, right? Because I know it's true. And so you learn about stuff like that and you kind of can see, oh, I see a lot of people had a problem with this one thing.
Uh-huh.
Well, that's kind of nice. You know, it's good to know because now I'll think about that more when I do the next one. You know, when you way back when you would kind of throw movies out, like you said, you'd mail out DVDs or you'd send things out, unless you were lucky and you were able to get a review somewhere, or if you're able to get something somewhere, there was no real consumer feedback. It was all just, well, they didn't ship it back to me, so they must love it.
Yeah. Right.
And so it's hard to kind of glean constructive criticism of it from it. So it is sort of like how we talked about before. There is that sort of two sides of it that's really good and sometimes not so good.
And you know what? The weirdest thing that is difficult to rectify for me
Mhm.
is the complete opposite reviews or comments.
Right.
The This movie had so much heart. I watched it twice. I'm going to show it to my family. Thank
Mhm.
you, filmmakers, for making this movie.
Right.
Oh, yeah. Oh, all those nights, all
It's
those
what you dream
sleepless.
about as a filmmaker. It's like that's the Oscar speech.
Yeah, all those nights of editing for 14 hours, and then
Right.
and just like losing all that stuff.
Mhm.
Um, And then you get, this movie was shit. I hated it. It was too long. Could this? I've seen paint dries faster than this movie moves.
Right.
And you sit there and you go, I don't like, I know there's tons of variations in this world, but I'm just curious. Like, those are the moments I would like to sit down at a table with both of those people,
Right.
have them both across from me, and then have them talk to each other
Right.
and just watch it and see, like, what were you, I mean, some of them you discount because, like, the nice thing about YouTube is someone writes something and then they have a YouTube. People can't snipe at you like they can cowardly on Amazon.
Hmm.
So at YouTube, you go and you look. Oh, they don't know that they should block all the videos they've liked. So they've liked videos on, like, animals having sex with animals and all this. I'm not too concerned about that person's opinion because they're probably on meth or doing something nefarious I don't want any part of. So those are the people that I'm not really that concerned about. But it is the intelligent person that really hates your movie.
Mm.
I find I'm actually, just from my background, I'm intrigued by. Like, that stuff I'm really fascinated by. You're intelligent, you're smart. What did you And I'm not saying the movies I've made are the best movies ever made. I'm not saying that. There's
Mhm.
people that hate The Godfather, and I think that was a great movie. But I know
Sure.
there's other people that don't like it. So, um, but that's when I'm really fascinated. That's where I find filmmaking fascinating, is when
Sure.
you have those types of experiences.
Well, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, listen, we're both, obviously, we're both filmmakers. We both also watch a lot of movies. We're both, I would consider, a somewhat smart movie watcher,
Right,
right?
right,
Like, and yet there are certainly movies that I watch that I'm like, that movie was terrible.
right.
You know, there's certainly movies that I watch that I'm just like, that was an awful, awful movie. I'm sorry I watched it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I understand what the work that went into it. I understand all of that.
Yeah,
And then I'll run into people who loved the movie.
yeah,
So it's not necessarily like, it's, yeah, it takes all shapes and sizes. And the one thing that is kind of a factor in this whole thing when we're talking about the internet specifically, or Amazon Prime or reviews, is like, most people don't most people won't say anything about something if it was just okay,
right.
right? So if it was like, that was all right, then they're not going to put a review,
Mm-hmm,
because it was just like, it was okay.
mm-hmm.
So you're getting people that are on one side of the spectrum or the other. And
Yeah.
so I think that sort of it blurs the line a little bit, because it gives you this false sense of what you think this movie is. Like, it gives you a false sense of like, oh my God, like people seem to either love it or hate it. When it's
Mm-hmm.
like, well, that's not really accurate. It probably runs the whole spectrum, but
Yeah.
it's just, in order for someone to take the effort of putting a review out, they have to feel strongly about it in some way, right?
Mm-hmm.
If they just thought it was like, well, that was pretty good,
Mm-hmm.
and now I'm going to go on with the rest of my day, then they're not going to write a review for it.
Yeah.
And so it was, to me, they sort of, it was one of the things that I disliked about, when this is probably jumping tracks a little bit, but when Netflix a few years ago, they took out the 5-star rating system and they changed it to just thumbs up and thumbs down.
Right.
And I thought that was like such a huge mistake, because I don't think it gives you a proper, sort of identification as to what the consensus of the movie was, right? Because
Yeah.
it kind of separates it a little bit too much. And I know, actually, technically, their DVD section, which I still get Netflix DVDs mailed to me, the
Mm.
DVD section still does do the 5-star rating.
Okay.
And so for me, being able to look at the rating of something, to me, it clues me in a little bit better than just whether or not, well, this is how many people voted it up, this is how many people voted it down.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't give me a good representation. Whereas, like, if I see, well, everyone who rated it, here's sort of the average of what everyone rated it, and maybe it figures it out mathematically. I don't know. Maybe I'm an idiot, and, well, I'm definitely an idiot, but maybe I just don't understand. But I like that idea of getting that gradient level of like, okay, well, most people think it's like a 3.5 out of 5. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, that's better than average.
Yeah.
You'll
Not
probably
bad.
get people who think it's it was not a waste of their time. Like they enjoyed the time they watched it. Maybe it didn't alter their life in some way, but they're happy that they saw it,
Hmm.
which I'm fine with, you know. But it does sort of it kind of piles on a little bit with the reviews, because I know Amazon specifically, you can't just rate it. You have to put a review in order to rate it. So that means that like you have to feel strongly enough about it to type something out. And I mean, I as an avid movie watcher, I don't think I've ever put a review on Amazon Prime ever, because
Yeah.
I don't really care.
Yeah.
And like, but yet when for Netflix, I will always rate the stars. So I'll watch a movie and I'll be like, oh, I think this is 2 stars, 3 stars, 4, 5, whatever. But I mean, if I had to write a review for everyone, I wouldn't even bother. Like, nah, it's
Mhm.
too much work.
Yeah.
But I could put a star system, and that's fine.
Yeah.
So you know, so it's you take it in that way. And now I've stopped looking at reviews. I've stopped looking at reviews a long time ago, and I'll check every once in a while just to see what's up. But it's more of, at this point, the last movie that I did was a while ago. I think I have a pretty good handle on where I think the movie's shortfalls are, where
Hmm.
I think it did well, and I'm able to sort of separate that a little bit and be like,
Yeah.
okay, here's a bunch of people who thought it was the worst thing that they ever saw. You know, I don't agree with any of that, so I'm just going to dismiss it.
Yeah.
Like you said, where you have like these two different opinions, where someone says, "Oh, the acting in this movie was the worst I've ever seen." And
Hmm.
you're like, okay, well, I think that's patently false. So I'm going to just discount that. I'm not even going to worry about it.
Yeah.
And you find your groove. You find your people like, okay, you've got some valid points. And so I'll that's fine. And so you kind of take a collection of that, and you're like, all right, I'll that's my some knowledge or experience of that movie. I will then take it on to my next one, and then make a whole boatload of new mistakes. But but I feel like you just got to do it, because it's too crazy otherwise.
I think that's very true that there are, every filmmaker knows there's certain things about their movie, um, that it's not like, oh, I'm going to pull the wool over your eyes on this, but I'm kind of telling myself that this thing doesn't bother me, this one moment in the movie or whatever.
Mhm.
Um, but I don't know how else to work around it unless reshoot the whole thing and rewrite it, and I don't have the budget for it. I have a couple of those, which there's no way in hell I'm going to share now, but I'll tell you later. And and sometimes those things have been brought up. I've read something and somebody has said like, oh, this one scene, and I'm like, I knew, the whole time. I was like, oh, I could not get that thing to work for whatever the reason. So, um, but it is a very interesting thing. So when did you start saying like, I want to do films? Like, what was that? Were you like a kid and you said, God, I really want to make movies? Did you say, I want to be a director of photography? Excuse me, I want to be a director. What was it that you really kind of, because obviously it's a journey, you have to really want to do this.
Yeah, I mean, no, I mean, when I was a kid, I loved movies as a kid, but I mean, I grew up in southeastern Massachusetts, in a fairly sort of rural blue collar area. And so the idea of being a filmmaker was not even really an option. Like, that was, you might as well just be like, I'm going to be, I don't know, I'm going to be like a, a, a spaceship captain. You know what I mean? Like, it was like that. It was that kind of a thing where there just
Yeah.
it wasn't really an option. And so as a kid, I loved movies and I loved watching movies, but it never really was anything that I considered doing until, I would say, I was in high school at the time. I was I was in high school. I was going to be an electrician, of all things.
Hmm.
I was going to a technical high school, which you're basically splitting your time between shop and a trade.
Hmm.
And like, to the point where I'm like, I mean, I know the school still exists that I went to, and I think they've changed it now a bit. But it's like it's a weird thing to be like, all right, you're 13 years old. You're now going to decide what your profession is for the rest of your life.
Hmm.
Go for it. It just seems like such a crazy, antiquated system.
Yeah.
But I digress. So I had decided when I was 13 years old, I was going to be an electrician. And somewhere in my junior, senior year, that's when I started getting into horror movies. And that's what kind of got me interested in making movies. So growing up, I had never watched really horror movies because they scared me too much.
Mm-hmm.
So I always stayed away from them. And then when I was in high school, I met a friend of mine who was super, super into horror movies. He was that friend where you go over his house and he's got all the VHS tapes of like every horror movie in
Right.
like a case,
Yeah.
stuff taped off a cable, stuff that he's bought. And I remember like going to his house and he's like, wait a minute, you're telling me you've never seen any of these? And I was like, nah, I've never really watched any horror movies. Like they always kind of scared me as a kid. He's
Mm-hmm.
like, oh my God, well, please sit down. I must show you these things. And so I would go over his house, or he'd come over to my house, and he would always bring VHS tapes of different stuff. And it was fascinating to me, kind of watching it years later, before, as opposed to a kid at that, now I'm 16 years old, still a kid, but looking at these movies in sort of a different light, and looking at them saying like, well, what was it about these movies that scared me so much as a kid?
Yeah.
And that's when I kind of got into the aspect of filmmaking as a thing, right? Because when you're a kid, you just watch a movie and it's a movie. You don't
Yeah.
really think about what's going on behind the scenes. And so then watching it as like a teenager and seeing it as like an actual thing that was made by people, it started to connect the dots of like, oh, well, it's by taking this, the lighting and the shot and the dialogue and the way the music composition is, and combining all these things together, it elicited this sort of involuntary response from me of being afraid. And
Mm.
it's like that was fascinating to me, that you could do all these different things and combine it all together and have an emotional effect on somebody that you don't know.
Yeah.
And that's what kind of got me interested. And so I'm like, well, I want to learn how to do that. How can I make that happen? And so then myself and this friend of mine, we started making little like horror shorts and things like that. And we kind of, just like everyone else, the VHS camera, and we started, well, no one does VHS anymore, but at our age, we would do like VHS stuff. And then kind of went from there. And so then I went to film school briefly in New York City, and learned a bit more of like the nuts and bolts of like how to make a movie,
Mm-hmm.
from a foundational perspective. And after I got done there, then it was just a matter of, all right, well, now what? Like, how do I get into this? How do I do it? And so, you know, at first you're looking for jobs, but then no one's really going to hire you as a director coming out of
Right.
school. So you just got to find an entry point, right? Like that's most of this business, is just finding an entry point. And so at first you mentioned IT before. So at first IT was my day job. And then on the side, I would make movies with my friend, and we would try and figure some stuff out and do things here and there.
Mm-hmm.
But then eventually, the IT thing, the just got to be too much of a burden, and I wasn't making enough strides in where I wanted to go and where I wanted to be. And so then it required some sort of larger scale move where it's like, okay, we got to like make some stuff happen. So that's when I moved. I'm in Brooklyn, so that's where I moved into New York City. And for my older movies, I had always, or mostly, I'd kind of shot it. I had owned the camera, and so I'd filmed a lot of the old movies that I did. And so I was familiar with cinematography and framing and composition and all that other stuff. And obviously working in IT, I had a pretty good, technical background. So I was able to like learn, I knew about the technical aspect of cameras and things like that.
Yeah.
And so it became sort of a natural way as an entry point into the filmmaking world, where I had some footage of things that I've shot, and now I could kind of put a little reel together and start pitching myself off as a cinematographer. And so that's when I started getting jobs doing a freelance cinematography work. And then it's just making kind of a lot of connections that way, and connecting the dots. And every project, you kind of meet more people and you expand your sort of world of knowledge, and kind of go from there. And so, I mean, as of right now, I still work as a freelance cinematographer. Matter of fact, I had a shoot earlier today.
Mm.
And so it's allowed me to sort of very gradually kind of transition, hopefully, as I go forward, more into the directing thing, which is what I want to do. You know, like you mentioned in the beginning, there was a lot of like hyphenated titles in that list that you mentioned, and my goal is to remove a lot of those hyphenations. It's
Hmm.
not even a word, hyphenation, but
Yeah.
that to remove those as much as I can. I'd love to get that down to just director. Like I don't want to be like writer, director, producer, DP, name it, all of the above, craft services guy, chef,
Yeah.
taxi driver. You know what I mean? Like I don't want to do all those things,
Yeah.
but I do know that in order to get to where I want to be, you have to kind of go through all of this other stuff in order to get there. Now, some people may not. Some people can find a way to get there really quickly or really directly, and they don't have to go through all this stuff. But I wasn't able to find a way to do that. And so for me, the desire to get to that point is strong enough where, hey, man, I'll do whatever I got to do to get to that point. Right. So if that means that I got to learn every job on the set, if that means I got to, do these 30 different jobs at the same time as everything else, if that means I gotta be a producer as well as a director and put all this stuff together, I'll do it. Like whatever gets me the means to an end kind of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's like I've done a lot of stuff, which I think, I don't know if it actually has, but I think knowing all that stuff has benefited me in a way, because understanding sort of all aspects of the filmmaking process, I think makes me a bit more sympathetic to sort of the other positions. When you have the ability to hire somebody and you have the ability to bring somebody on board, you kind of have a better idea as to like, well, I know what their job is because I've done it. And
Yeah.
so I can be a little more sympathetic when they tell me they need something or whatever.
Hmm.
But yeah, man, it's a weird world where I feel like there's no other world where you have to do this sort of thing. Like, I mean, if you're a cardiologist, like I don't think there's a point where you have to be like a wet nurse at some point. Like it's a weird industry where you're nobody has no one has like a perfect blueprint to do. Okay, here's step 1, 2, 3, and 4, and now you're done.
Yeah.
Everyone kind of gets to it in a different way, and this just happened to be sort of mine.
Yeah. Well, I think it's good to. I mean, I'm always a big believer that the captain should know his ship, and he should know the different departments. He
Mhm.
doesn't have to be an expert in them all, but he should at least be familiar with them. And
Okay.
I don't. I mean, I've held a boom. I've been a PA. I haven't technically gotten nearly as involved as you have. I mean, I remember I think when we were doing Clandestine, you showed me the camera, and I'm like, "Where's the camera?" And you said, "This is the camera." I was like, "Yeah, but what is this?" And you're like, "It's called a DSLR. They're relatively new." And I'm like, "We can film a movie on this," So yeah, there's like those elements that you also then know, like, well, I want to work with people who are really great in these other areas, and then you have the personalities, you want to really work with people that you get along with, because it is so difficult, and there's so much work that you have to put into just getting to that first day of filming, and then finishing your movie, and then you have the post process. You can get very I've had situations with editors that were nightmares. You just were kind of like, wow. So, it's there's so many different elements to it, and just trying to get all those pieces together and having a knowledge of them all is important. Being able to, I think, judge people and bring a good casting crew together is important.
Yeah.
What
Well,
is,
I feel like I mean, you did the same thing, just from a slightly different angle. You came at it more from the acting side.
mhm,
So like, your ability to understand what it's like to be an actor, I mean, that's something that I don't have a lot of experience in. And
right,
so when you come at your directing side, the fact that you know what it's like to be in the actor's shoes, I feel like helps you as a director. At least from the outside, it certainly seemed that way. It helps for you to connect with the people that are acting because you've been there.
Yeah.
And so, in the same thing with you as an editor, you've done a lot of editing. And so, I think that's helped you when you're directing. And you tell me if I'm wrong, but I feel like when you're directing, you're also the ability to edit in your head because you know how it works.
Yeah.
You understand how editing works, you know how things are going to be transitioning, and you understand how stuff's going to be moving along. And so you can understand better as to what you need because you have that experience. So yeah, maybe you don't have the cinematography experience, but I feel like you came at the same way, just from a slightly different angle.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I don't disagree. I think that it's there is that element. Like when I told you, I opened up the old clandestine hard drive from 8 years ago and dusted that thing off, and thankfully it didn't explode on me. But um, I was looking at stuff, and there were moments where like there are scenes that we didn't use, and I knew when we were filming them, I'm probably not going to use this scene because
Mm,
I'm already kind of running in my head as an editor how this is all going to piece together, and I know this doesn't work right now.
mm,
It also helped with other moments where I knew audio was going to be a nightmare because and I would say to this our sound guy Kip for that movie, how's the audio, and I just had a feeling it was going to be a problem, so we would have to change something or alter it. And then what you mentioned about an actor thing, it was hysterical because I never really intended to be a director. I just wanted to really be an actor. That was my thing. And the first thing we did, which was that mockumentary called This End Up I told you about,
mm,
which was the most politically incorrect thing probably ever made. But um, it was, I remember the guy that I co-created that with, he was supposed to direct the whole thing. And he got very anxious in talking to the actors. And then one time he said, "Listen, you got a really great way of talking to the actors because you are one. I think you should direct the actors moving." This was after like the second episode or whatever. He's like, "I think you should really direct the actors because you've been doing it anyway, and
mm,
I'll just focus on all the setups." Because he goes, "For me, I mean," he's like, "I say, well." The actor says to me, "Well, why should I do that?" And I'm like, "Because you're the director and you should do. I'm the director and you should do it."
mm,
And I'm like, yeah, that doesn't work with actors. They get a little pissed. And you want to try to keep actors very fluid and, like water, very just so that they're willing and they trust you to try stuff. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of different, that's the thing I think that's so cool about the industry is there are so many different ways that you can come to things and try to make your mark and try to get your film made. And then see all those pieces kind of come together.
mm. And it's funny. I remember when we shot Clandestine, one of the first, it might have been even the first day of filming or second day of filming. I don't remember. It might have been, at least it was the first weekend of filming, I believe.
Yeah.
And I remember specifically how I knew that you were good working with actors because we were shooting a scene. It was in a bedroom, and it was like several takes, and it was kind of going along. And I remember you keyed in on a very specific thing that was you felt that the actress was her chest was really tight,
Mm.
right? And it was like a very specific thing that you keyed in on. You're like, I feel like you're very bound up, and I need you to take a breath, and I need you to relax, and I need you to kind of let it go.
Yeah.
And I just remember that was like a very specific note that you wouldn't generally get. Um, like the partner that you had, where if they were just sort of a director from that perspective of like, well, just do it this way.
Hmm.
Um, and so I thought that was like a very key piece of information because then she did, and it was a much better take, and it felt better, and it all worked. But
Yeah.
I remember that specifically, you telling her that, and it was like, oh yeah, that's great. Like that's like I feel like you understand what it's like to be in that scenario, kind of to your point of having it flow and being loose and whatever.
Mm.
And yeah, I just remember that moment, and that's what I kind of was like, oh, he definitely knows, like he definitely knows how to deal with actors specifically.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, and the thing that was crazy, it was also nice because I knew her and I had worked with her so many times, and I knew what she was capable of doing, and I knew she wasn't doing it
Mm,
for whatever the reason. And I figured there was probably something going on for her. But and then the crazy thing is that I think that was take 7. When I told her no more takes, I'm not going to do it anymore unless you do this.
Right.
And I'm going to have to create the performance in the editing. And she wasn't too happy with that, but she got pissed, which was good, because then she used it, and she did such a good job. Take 7 is the whole take for that scene.
Yeah.
That entire scene, she just nailed it. It was like a theater performance. She just, from beginning to end, I literally took her whole entire take 7 and I just dropped in the other actor throughout it because she just did such a great job. And that's what happens. And it's, I don't know. I love filmmaking because of those moments. It's so unpredictable. It can be anxiety inducing, but there's also such these great moments of like rich reward, when your project is done or it's coming together. You're sitting there and you're watching these things you've envisioned in your head, come to life. It's very cool. Join us in 2 weeks for part 2 with guest Brad Rego.